Elise Miller, welcome to the new school.
Thank you so much, Michael. It's a privilege to be here.
Wonderful to have you. So we are recording this conversation just a short few weeks before you step down as the director of the Collaborative on Health and the Environment.
That's right.
Which has been part of Commonweal for many years. You were a co-founder of what we call CHE, the Collaborative on Health and the Environment. But actually, we began to work together long before that in 1993 when I asked you to become the first executive director of the Jennifer Altman Foundation.
That's right.
What is your memory of the first time we met?
That's a great question. Well, first of all, I had moved to California without a job after my graduate work and just had felt pulled here. And I didn't know about Commonweal. I didn't know about you and the cancer health programs that you were doing and other work. And so I had the good fortune of John Kabat-Zinn, who some people know. I asked him, like, who does he know on the West Coast kind of thing? And he had suggested that I contact you. So when I sent my resume and got a call and said, come out to Bolinas, I wasn't even sure where Bolinas was, and nor did I know its reputation at the time. And so, you told me to take the first right past the third tree, and then there was no signs, but really it was all okay. And so when we met, I remember just being in awe of the breadth of what was emerging and all the activities under this one roof. And I felt almost teary-eyed because I had felt, as I walked through my life, trying to find a place where all of me could show up. And having a very eclectic interest and seeing the connections. But most often in society, people want to put you, label you as X. You're going to work in this sector or that sector. And here was someone who clearly didn't care about boundaries and labels. And I thought, oh my gosh, I could actually work in a place that would allow me to fully be who I am. And so I remember being nervous. I remember not quite knowing anything about this place, but also feeling just at home. It was profound.
Yeah. And neither of us knew a thing about how to run a foundation.
Neither of us knew a thing about it. I was 29, and I didn't know anything about the foundation, but I knew I could type and file and organize a few things. And
that was 24 years ago, almost to
almost to the day.
Almost
24 years ago, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I was saying to you before we started that we've managed to do pretty well with each other.
We sure have.
So, yeah. And so Jennifer Altman Foundation was left in my care by Jennifer Altman, who was an alumna of the Commonweal Cancer Health Program. And she left $12 million, which for foundations is tiny, but it was a huge amount to me, and essentially said, she hoped we would support Commonweal and do other good things in the world. What is your memory of your years as the executive director of the Jennifer Altman Foundation?
Well, I think it was a lot of sort of experimenting on some level. The investments we chose to make, I think, very much reflected Commonweal's interests in mind-body health, in juvenile justice issues, and environmental health. So there was that sense of it being something of an extension and a way of giving to other organizations that are working in those sectors. So I think we both did a lot of learning. I think with the board as well, trying to figure out where were the best investments, and hundreds of proposals coming in, and again, we were new. So how do you really assess the effectiveness of different projects? And we learned along the way, and we made some mistakes that were whatever, maybe not invested in the best possible places, but it was really allowed certainly me to explore these very different sectors and understand their connections. And I was particularly drawn to the environmental health piece. And so I got to know the players in this field that was just really emerging or coalescing. And you know, the major people who were the movers and shakers, Pete Myers, Theo Colburn, others, just, you know, I came on board around when they were developing some of their work and writing their book, Our Stolen Future. And so I got to be with and talk with some of the great minds who were really strategizing to create this movement. So it was a real incredible privilege to do that.
Before we go further in that direction, which I want to pursue, the work on environmental health, what are some of the early grants that just really struck you personally in one way or another?
Well, one of the very first grants we made actually was to the Whidbey Institute. You had known Fritz and Vivian Hull, and they had sent in a proposal. They had been the Chinook Learning Center. And so it was, and that actually played a key role, little did I know, to my being drawn, my husband and I being drawn to moving up to Whidbey later on. So that there was those types of grants.
Just parenthetically, Whidbey Island being an island north of Seattle, where you settled with Dan, built a house with your hands, Dan being an extraordinary craftsman. And then we'll talk more about what you did up there. But Whidbey Island then, in part because of you, became an important part of my life and Commonwealth's life. So there's the
all cycles
there's
together.
The Whidbey vector in this. That's very significant.
Right.
So back to other than the environmental health, what were some of the early projects that you remember?
Well, one was one was supporting Our Stolen Future. I mean, really sort of most of our work was around educating, getting the science out there, trying to figure out which organizations had that capacity to bring the science and get it into more mainstream audiences. And so our work was really to promote those activities. And I think what we did was we helped to define a field in environmental health through our grant making, trying to very clearly focus on what could leverage this into mainstream thinking, because environmental health really, in some ways, was a stepchild of sorts of the environmental movement. It sort of came up in the shadows of the environmental movement and also was kind of coming alongside the environmental justice movement. But what was unique about environmental health was really putting human health absolutely at the center of decision-making. And that distinguished it. Certainly environmental justice puts human health, but it's really in a justice frame. It's in a human rights frame. And this was very, the environmental health movement really focused on human health in relationship to our society, and then focused more on the toxic chemicals piece of it, and chose that as the strategy moving forward. And it's now evolved more, which we can get to. But I think our work in doing those early investments in environmental health allowed more groups to come forward. There was only a few groups in that field, and some research scientists and so forth that were doing the work, but allowed more to come forward and again define why it is so important that human health is put in the center of everything we think about, every policy we make, every market decision we make. So that I feel was. And we were obviously doing this with other people, but that was a great sense of progress and momentum that we helped to build.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting to think about this because 24 years ago when we started, nobody had ever heard of the environmental health movement.
Right.
It was called the National Toxics Coalition. It was all framed in terms of toxics. The National Toxics Coalition had come together and then collapsed with a lot of acrimony on a lot of different people's parts. So toxics work was in the ashes. Meanwhile, Pete Myers and Theo Colburn were bringing a whole new perspective to it, which was about endocrine-disrupting chemicals. And my memory is of meeting Pete at a meeting of the consultative group on biodiversity, which Catherine Porter, our friend and colleague, was running. And Pete gave a talk on endocrine-disrupting chemicals, and one of our early grants was to publicize their book, Our Stolen Future. And then working with Gary Cohen, who became the head of Healthcare Without Harm, and Charlotte Brody, who was the co-director with him for a while, and others, and it was essential. We reframed the toxics work as the environmental health movement. And I wrote an early essay called The Age of Extinctions and the Emerging Environmental Health Movement, which did the equivalent of going viral in the pre-viral age that I wrote, but where the nomenclature of the environmental health movement really took shape. And it was a much more inclusive term than toxics. And it connected toxics specifically to human health. So those were incredibly creative days.
Absolutely.
And as you say, at that point, there was no Health and Environmental Funders Network. Which today, you know, there's something, Kathy Sessions, who runs it, tells me that there's something like $200 million a year now going into environmental health and justice worldwide. None of that existed. None of that existed 24 years ago. So what we're describing here is our tiny piece of a movement that took shape and that can, in some sense, be dated to the last quarter of a century, where toxics work became the environmental health and justice movement, and that became a very powerful movement indeed.
I do remember those first days of going to the Grant Makers in Health meeting, and Jennifer Altman Foundation was very involved with the Environmental Grant Makers Association, but those first forays into this world of the health grant makers and trying to have them think about environment, and it's, you know, it's been an ongoing challenge, but you were very instrumental in finally making those links, and the Health and Environmental Funders Network emerged.
And the way we got to Grant Makers in Health, which, as you say, did not have any history of interest in these issues, was that my mentor, Phil Lee, enabled us to get connected with them. And Phil, of course, played a tremendous role as an early board member of the Jennifer Altman Foundation. He was chancellor of the University of California, San Francisco, and former undersecretary of health under both Johnson and Clinton, I think.
There was two separate.
On two occasions. And really an extraordinary, extraordinary figure in the field, to whom Commonweal and the Jennifer Altman Foundation owe a tremendous amount. So that was then, and this is now. So that was 1993. And so you served for 5 years as the first director of the Jennifer Altman Foundation. And I know we're both delighted that Shori Myers, who's the new executive director, is here today with us. In fact, Pete Myers' daughter, to close the loop to our early work on endocrine disruption, but a rising force in environmental health philanthropy in her own right. Who is doing extraordinary work in the field. So in 1998, after 5 years of work together, you decided to move up to Whidbey Island. Tell us what drew you to Whidbey. What is Whidbey like? And what is Whidbey like?
Well, throughout my life, and this kind of relates to why I moved to California without a job, I get these kind of strong hits about what needs to happen next. And I'm in one of those transition times right now. But when we started getting to know some of the people on Whidbey, and it was partly through like the grant we made to the Whidbey Institute, and then Kurt Holting, who's a wonderful friend and neighbor on Whidbey and takes people up to Alaska. Dan and I did one of his trips, and getting off the plane, having just done a trip with Kurt, the float plane in Alaska was Rick Ingrassi and Peggy Taylor and other people we got to know who were very much part of the the rich life on Whidbey. And so I think we were drawn there because we wanted to live more on a human scale. And there were so many creative people from different parts of our lives. My old high school friend from Virginia, she and her husband had moved there. One of my professors in graduate school was there. Other colleagues, I was thinking of Betsy and Charles, who had been in New York City doing their work, decided to
Charles
move.
Terry and Betsy McGregor.
That's right. That's right. And Charles had been with the Rockefeller Brothers, and Betsy is a pediatrician. And so there was just this incredible richness of people moving there. And we realized, wow, we could have even a better social life here and more sense of community than in the Bay Area, where we had dear friends, of course, but we were all spread out, and it took 2 hours to go have dinner with someone.
You could also afford to buy a piece of land.
And we could also afford to, yeah. So we were, when we started looking at properties in Marin, and, thinking we'd have to pay $800,000 for a, one room and with an outhouse, we decided. So we did find 10 acres, which of course we could have never afforded in this area, and decided to build our own home. And unfortunately, my husband Dan is very much expert in that realm, and so we had this year-long process, which we actually stayed together, which is but it was. What we kept finding was a sense of connection and community and support. And I had worried about going to Whidbey initially. I mean, I thought, oh gosh, small community and, kind of ingrown, and, who knows what people are saying behind your back. And there's, and sort of feeling, maybe I'm more in a fishbowl. And it has not been like that at all. The people who have chosen to move there, I think, I've also chosen that lifestyle. I've chosen a desire to live more consciously and with more kindness and care, both for each other and the earth, and really reflecting our values. And it's certainly proven that. I pinch myself sometimes when I get involved or am asked to participate in yet some other amazing event or organization on Whidbey Island, which is just... it feels very rare. There are other places, of course, but it feels very rare. And I think there's something about having an island with very distinct, geography and boundaries also helps to cultivate that kind of community.
So after you were there for a little less than a year, you decided to continue your work in environmental health, which you've done with the Jennifer Altman Foundation. Tell us about what you did, what you developed.
Sure. Well, the first 6 months we were on Whidbey, I decided to start a little consulting business, and I called it EQUIS, E-Q-U-I-S, for equity, equality, universality, integrity, and sustainability, which were the qualities that I wanted to evoke. And so I did a few white papers for the California Wellness Foundation, but I didn't want to just consult. And so I was on the I think the Nordic track at the athletic club with another friend of mine next, and I said, I've just got to start this new nonprofit on children's environmental health. And so we went to the local cafe and started writing on napkins. And she, Stephanie Ryan, was one of my first board members and so forth. And so what that was, we called the Institute for Children's Environmental Health. And during my time at the Altman Foundation, I realized there were a couple gaps that weren't being addressed at that time in the environmental health growing field. And one was that the few entities that were working on environmental health were not in conversation with each other. There was some tension between founders. They were, different enough. There was a scarcity of resources, and so there was some territorialness going on. And I felt very strongly, which is my tendency, that we all ought to sit around the same table. And so I worked to one of the first projects I took on was to host the Summit on Children's Environmental Health in New York. And that was the very first time about 30 of the core people in the children's environmental health world came together. And some of our closest colleagues still were in that room. And out of
Who
that,
was there?
so Dick Jackson, who was at the CDC and now is at UCLA, the Dean of School of Public Health. Phil Landrigan, who has been one of the leaders in the environmental health at Mount Sinai School of Medicine. There was Ken Cook, Environmental Working Group. Charlotte Brody, who was then working with Healthcare Without Harm, I guess, right? And that I think that had started. You're right, right. So, and then some of the smaller organizations, like the Children's Environmental Health Network, which was really the first in the field to even develop an NGO, was present. So we decided to craft the first joint principles. Guiding principles on children's environmental health, and this was a a 3-month wordsmithing activity after we left the meeting that I facilitated, and finally it's relatively short, but with a group of people trying to write anything, but it laid out what our priorities, principles, and values were for the field, and it wasn't just one entity doing it or the other. It was really all of us. And so I ended up saying, well, why don't we have a partnership for children's environmental health that's distinct from any one of our organizations or institutions? And so the logo actually had several of the other logos blended into it. So again, it wasn't representing just one organization. It really was trying to express the sense of this the wholeness of and the collaboration between all these groups. And so we had, for the next 2, maybe 3 or 4 years, we had annual meetings, and some of our Canadian partners came down as well, and we hosted them in different parts of the United States. And I think that really helped spawn many more organizations, often smaller, in different regions of the United States, working on children's environmental health. So this was, I think, part of it, and then it really wasn't needed anymore. I mean, the partnership kind of fell away in part because there were connections. We built the trust between these groups. More organizations were involved, and there was kind of a network that was established. And so we didn't need to do that formally anymore.
So from there, let's go to 2002, which was the founding of CHE, the Collaborative on Health and the Environment. What is your memory of how CHE came into being?
Well, I remember being in this room, in fact, with a number of other players, but it really started, we had a conference at the University of California, San Francisco, and we had a number of people who were doing research on health, how environment was affecting certain health endpoints, whether that was heart disease, Parkinson's, learning and developmental disabilities, and so forth. And so after that conference, a smaller group came here to Commonweal and met and began to strategize about what was missing in the environmental health field at that point. What else could we bring forward that would really leverage this way of thinking about health and the environment? And we had some of the, I think, smartest people in the room and a number of people representing different health-affected groups in the room, brain cancer, endometriosis. There was just a wide range. And that really evoked a sense, well, what about if these health-affected groups had this information, if they knew the science and could talk about it with their respective constituencies, and then go to their policymakers or their decision makers, whether on the local level, state level, national, or even international, with this knowledge, could that be a turning point? Because of course, when you have a disease or you have a disability, it's as personal as it gets, right? And if you know that one contributor might well be toxic exposures, and you find this out and you integrate that into your narrative and go to your policymakers, it is a real statement. And so really that was a strategy that emerged, was if we can have all these different health-affected groups empowered with this science, and then in turn, they take it out to their constituencies and decision makers, then we could have we could strengthen the movement that's there. And I think that was very, very smart. And so the collaborative continues to since 2002. But I guess when
now in our 15th year.
Yeah, right. That's exactly right. And so at that inception of CHE, we thought what would be some different working groups? Where was the science the strongest? And one place was with learning and developmental disabilities, where environment played a role. And there was a fair, it's grown exponentially since then, but there was enough scientific literature where we could say something about this. And so I had the good fortune of being asked then to run what was called the Learning and Developmental Disabilities Initiative. I was still heading up the Institute for Children's Environmental Health, but this became an extension of our work. And that program was wanted to take off partly because we had funding, right? So we had our first national meeting in Washington, D.C. with some of the key people in different learning and developmental disabilities organizations. And out of that, we went around and did workshops and went to meetings, their annual meetings, and talked about environmental health science, got on their programs and on their agendas. Some of them created programs, and I'm talking about the Learning Disabilities Association of America, the Autism Society, the National Association for the Duly Diagnosed, the American Association for the Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities. So there were these core groups that really got on board. And again, we were funded and I think made a real difference. The organization that has stayed most involved is still the Learning Disabilities Association, because they really had a cultural support within the organization for that, this work. And another major trajectory of CHE since its inception was reproductive health and fertility. And this was in large part because of Ali Carlson, whom I know is, and she is, here she is.
Hey, Ali,
and so Ali Carlson, and she can tell the story far better than I, but basically started knocking on doctors' doors and saying, well, why do I have to deal with this infertility issues? And what, does the environment play a role? And basically through her incredible persistence and dedication, and fortunately chose to work with CHE, she really helped to orchestrate this, what has really shaped and changed the field of reproductive health. Through Ali's work and others, there was the first scientific consensus statement that was developed, organized, and the Vallombrosa statement. And then there was another conference that brought in other people interested in reproductive health and the environment. And out of all of this is a much longer story. It's actually detailed on our website. But out of this came the first academic program on reproductive health and the environment in the United States at UCSF. And Linda Giudice, who's been spearheading that, and now Tracy Woodruff has taken that over. And they have done extraordinary work and managed to get major mainstream, like the American Society of Reproductive Medicine on board with these issues and others. And this took, just dedication over years, but made it happen, and it's still going very, very strong. Our work in CHE is not as active just because, once again, all these other organizations, they've taken the, bull and run with it. But it's just fascinating, once again, how just a few people with that kind of passion, smarts and strategy and dedication make it happen.
I remember my wife, Cheryl Patton, introduced me to Ali, and Cheryl's here too, and has been very active in Che and all of this from the start. And I remember being in Cheryl's office upstairs with Ali and listening to her interest in fertility and pregnancy and reproductive compromise and so forth, and looking at her and having the same sense of recognition that I had with you about what you could do in the world. And I said to her, Ali, you could be the Elise Miller of reproductive health and fertility.
And you went, who's Elise?
No, she knew who you were. She knew who you were. And I think that planted a seed. And Ali, working with Pete Myers and excuse me?
And Ted Shetler
and many others. Ted Shetler's here. Bob Gould is here. So quite a few of our, Neil Gendel is here. Heather Sarantis is here. Quite a few of our... Yes, I mentioned Cheryl being here. Quite a few of our colleagues are here today. But in any case, what you did with LDDI, the Learning and Developmental Disabilities Initiative, and what Ali did with pregnancy compromise and fertility and reproductive health, those were two of the keystone developments in Che's intention, which was to bring the health-affected groups together as a force to talk about what this meant in the lives of people who've been affected. And, you know, it's so interesting to me because I didn't realize this at all at the time we were doing it, but karmically it's interesting that, and I began to talk about it early on. You know, I'm a DES son. My mother took DES, diethyl silvestrate, which was being marketed by the pharmaceutical industry as a way to prevent miscarriages because she'd had 4 or 5 before she managed to stay pregnant with me. And of course, the pharmaceutical industry knew while they were marketing it from animal studies that, that this first endocrine disruptor to be identified, the first, was causing a very high rate of a very rare reproductive cancer in women, in female mice or rats, whichever they were studying. And they knew that. But they sat on that until it turned out that there was an epidemic of cervical cancers among young girls. And then it came out. And they fought tooth and nail to keep DES on the market, you know, through this process. So I wasn't thinking about any of that when I first started to imagine Che, which was in conversations with Gary Cohen and Charlotte Brody. And I had some acronym like CHA-CHA. I forget, it was like Community Health Alliances for something or other. And I had this fantasy that we'd go around into neighborhoods and cities all over the country and have health-affected groups talking on loudspeakers on corners, you know. And it didn't turn out exactly that way, but it was a fair approximation of it. And then there was a very important meeting with Gary Cohen and Pete Myers and Beto Badal from Marisla Foundation and me in Laguna Beach, where Pete and Gary, who have been 2 of the top strategists in this whole field and have both been mentors of mine. Fortunately, my mentors are almost always younger than I am, which is a very good thing. And they really blessed this idea. They said, yeah, we need that strategy. And particularly with the whole field of endocrine disruptors coming in, because up until then, the dose made the poison, and the larger the dose of chemicals, the more toxic it was. And the revolution in this thinking, which started with Theo and Pete, was that endocrine disrupting chemicals during pregnancy and early childhood could work at parts per million or parts per billion or whatever. And as Pete uses the acronym, it uses the metaphor, as if they could hijack the controls of a passenger plane and set it on a completely different trajectory. And so these endocrine disrupting chemicals at incredibly low levels, not necessarily the dose makes the poison, at incredibly low levels during pregnancy and early childhood, could result in lifelong diseases. And the list has continued to grow.
Right.
And now, we face the possibility that some of these chemicals act over more than one generation, that some of them are obesogens, which can contribute. Nobody talks, even to this day, in public discourse. Everybody talks about obesity as a huge, over half the population. But still, nobody talks about the solid science that some of these endocrine disruptors, including DES, by the way, there are rat studies that show that given at a certain point in a rat's development, that DES can make a rat obese.
Right.
But studies at UC Irvine and elsewhere have demonstrated that that this obesity can go on over several generations and so on. So even though we've been working on this for 15 years, and even though we've made tremendous progress, the fact remains that chemicals in general and endocrine-disrupting chemicals in particular, the story of how they affect health is still tremendously underappreciated.
Absolutely. And even issues and concerns like lead, where at a higher dose, we're trying to lower the dose of lead exposure to lower blood lead levels. But then we find out it's an endocrine disrupting chemical as well. So that means that minute amounts it can have effects. And so that hadn't been understood for a long, long time. So even the chemicals that we actually did bring some attention to, we realized, there's this whole other way of thinking and scientifically that would suggest they can impact health as well and at doses you would never have imagined before.
Now, if we just talk for a moment about what happened from that point 24, 25 years ago when we started rebuilding toxics work as environmental health. And again, I want to point to Gary and Pete because they complemented each other in a very interesting way. Pete works more from the science space and environmental health media and thinking about how one moves large mainstream scientific communities, especially the Endocrine Society, which has turned out... I actually originally thought that the king on the chessboard of this game was the American Cancer Society. And I spent years trying to convince the American Cancer Society to be concerned about this. But the problem was that the American Cancer Society, which does good work and has many good people in it, gets a lot of funding from the chemical industry, which has been very aware that if they can head the American Cancer Society in the direction it naturally goes, which is to support pharmaceutical development and so on and so forth, and stay away from chemicals, that would be a good thing. But I didn't realize, and I should have, that the real king on the chessboard in endocrine disruption was the Endocrine Society, and that the Endocrine Society was not captive, as the American Cancer Society is, to the influence of the chemical industry. And so it has turned out, in large part, I would say, as a result of the work that people in our community has done, Pete and many, many others, and the work that Che has done and other organizations, that the Endocrine Society, which truly got endocrine disruptors and are the world authority on endocrine disruption, came to be activists, not just acknowledging the science, but activists in bringing the science into these policy venues in Europe and the United States and so on.
And they are the best messengers for this.
And they're the best messengers. So it's been and therefore, in addition to the science, then Gary and others created this template of organizing where they said, we want, healthcare without harm. We want military toxics. We want healthy building network. We want all these different industrial sectors. And the theory was that if we weaned the industrial sectors, which were dependent on chemicals, off of their chemical dependency, and including the healthcare sector is a critical set of spokespeople, but all the other industrial sectors as well. If we could wean them of their dependence on chemicals and do the work that Ali Carlson and others have been doing on green chemistry and creating green chemicals, and that would be a way of transforming an industry that really, climate change gets all the headlines and has sucked a huge amount of resources into the struggle to prevent climate change. And yeah, of course.
Right.
But the fact remains that the fact that we're all carrying hundreds and hundreds of these chemicals in our bodies is a very, very profoundly serious thing for not only humans, but for all life on Earth.
Right, and it's with climate change and environmental health, they really are two branches of the same root of the tree, which is the petrochemical industry.
Exactly.
And so they are intimately related. All the chemicals that are causing health problems on our environmental health branch are the same ones that have actually contributed to climate change. And so when we can blend those and show the relationship, I think that's an effective message.
Yeah. Now, in addition to the work you did with learning and developmental disability, and we should mention Ruth Hennig and the John Merck Fund as having really driven that work for a long, long period of time. And Ruth, of course, now, with Charlotte Brody and others, is doing Healthy Babies, Bright Futures, which continues the work in children's environmental health.
That's right.
That you were so instrumental in doing early on. But we also had a very positive impact on the President's Cancer Panel on cancer and the environment.
That's right.
And that was something that Charlotte Brody, when she was the executive director of Commonweal, really championed. And Shay really went to work to help the staff and the directors of the President's Cancer Panel to hear the science on cancer and the environment.
Right. So this was the very first President's Cancer Panel that focused on environment and cancer. Though the panel had been established in 1976, I believe, it wasn't until, 2008, I think, somewhere in there, that they actually finally thought, oh, well, maybe we'll consider environmental factors. And number of our close colleagues, researchers and advocates, Dick Clapp from Boston University, were very instrumental in behind the scenes, creating documents, fact sheets, providing testimony. And it was that they came out, the President's Cancer Panel came out with an amazingly strong statement that we are doing incalculable harm to the American public by not considering environmental factors.
With two panelists, neither of whom expected to do this in the first place, and were very credible mainstream spokespeople. So here this extraordinary report comes out, and guess what? The American Cancer Society tries to bury it, tries to say, no, it isn't really that important. But despite their opposition, this became one of the most downloaded reports in the history of these panels and so forth. It's widely distributed across the country and around the world, and very authoritative.
That's right.
So those are the learning and developmental disabilities work, the fertility and pregnancy compromise work, and the President's Cancer Panel. If we were to pick three highlights, there have been many, many others on which we've worked.
Right.
I think of the work Ted Shetler's done on asthma, for example. That's had a big impact in Massachusetts. Ted, could you say a word about what Massachusetts has done with asthma work?
One of the Che partners, Polly Hoppin, has spearheaded this effort in Massachusetts, but the long and the short of it is that Massachusetts is the first state in the country that actually has the primary prevention of asthma written into the state plan for asthma control. Every state has such a program, but Massachusetts is the only one that has primary prevention of asthma, keeping people from getting asthma in the first place, not just making it less problematic for them after they have the disease. So this is really groundbreaking, and it's a tough slog, because we need more research and so forth, but we also need to put to work what we already know about preventing asthma. So that's one of the pioneering efforts that's going on.
Ted, as you've heard this first part of this conversation, did any reflections come to your mind, things that you would add that we may not have emphasized?
I think you hit all the highlights. I think that you've begun to build toward. You've gone from the toxics to the environmental health field, and you're now sort of beginning to realize that the toxic chemicals fit into a larger analysis.
Right. That's exactly where we're going.
Yeah, and but I think that you've laid this out very nicely.
Just so everyone knows, Ted Shetler is our science director for the collaborative, as well as science director for the Science and Environmental Health Network, and has been kind of our go-to guy for pretty much everything. The running joke is that when TED Talks started to be a phenomena, and people would sit around, we were kind of just hearing about these TED Talks, and we thought, well, Ted knows everything about pretty much everything, so maybe he's just, this TED Talks. And so, whether it's reproductive health, neurological health, breast cancer, asthma, so many issues, Ted has been just critical for our work. Yeah.
So since we're talking about Ted's work here, one of our recent achievements really builds on Ted's work of many years, because Ted has been the principal force within CHE driving the concept of the ecological paradigm of health.
That's right.
And our new website is focused on that.
Right.
And it's very interesting. Let me just do this as a preface, because Ted wrote an extraordinary book called The Ecology of Breast Cancer, which I wrote the introduction for. And I think Ted convinced all of us early on that, in fact, the research on endocrine disrupting chemicals led us inevitably to the recognition that it wasn't just chemicals that were affecting people's health. There were these wide range of other factors. So as we developed the ecological paradigm of health, we began to get pushback from some of our colleagues who were the activists on trying to do something about chemicals, who were saying, wait a minute, this new, complexity theory, ecological paradigm of health is going to play right into the hands of the chemical industry, because they're going to be able to emphasize all these other issues that are going on. And we're very concerned about it.
Right.
But we didn't have any choice, because the Collaborative on Health and the Environment is about the science.
Right.
And the science was pointing us at the ecological paradigm.
Right.
And rather than wait for the chemical industry to take this and, frame it in their terms, we wanted to frame this as it should be framed, as a deeper understanding. And we believed, and believe to this day, because chemicals remain part of the DNA and the backbone of CHE, that the story about how chemicals affect health could survive complexity theory and the ecological paradigm and the recognition of all these other factors.
Right. Well, I think the focusing on chemicals has been one of the best strategies, I think, to finally bring attention to those issues, because people were looking at social determinants of health or access to health care or other concerns. And so I think and it continues to be absolutely necessary for a good part of the sector to say, okay, we still need to keep moving on those particular issues. And I think the green chemistry piece is a complement to that, as you described. And at the same time, the science has gotten stronger, and where we can look at what the built environment and the socioeconomic concerns and the nutrition and all these other factors that impact our development, including chemicals, and really start to elaborate on that very complex understanding and network of things that impact us. And it's as Ted would say, it's incredibly challenging, because as you go more into it, the more complex it gets. And so it's both holding it in that frame, which does reflect, I think, the truth of the science, and this is the truth of our experience as we live in ecological wholeness. We are interconnected with everything else.
This is a holistic theory of health.
Right. Right.
It's a holistic theory of health.
Exactly,
yeah.
Exactly. And so since that's the essence of it, sure, we can focus on one piece to the other, but it's also the synergistic effects of these factors that we're trying to understand at multiple layers. And I've learned so much from Ted about even how to describe these issues, because it's been such a core part of Ted's writing and work, and it's really brought that to Che. And now with the new website that we developed over this last year, to have that reflected graphically as well as throughout our site is really exciting. And I think it does provide a framework for a lot of the other organizations that are working on toxic chemicals or the built environment or socioeconomic concerns, social determinants of health, to have a home and to see the connections. And that's what we really, I think, are aspiring to do. I mean, one thing that I feel like I still haven't seen happen, that has been a bee in my bonnet for a number of years, is to truly have those who have been working on social determinants of health, like the ACE studies, the adverse childhood effect studies, that show that kids who are exposed to abuse and exposed to poverty and other social issues have higher risk of heart disease and diabetes and so forth growing up. And we find the same thing with toxic chemicals and yet these two areas really do not converse at this point. There's still quite the distinction. Are some of the major funders, whether it's Robert Wood Johnson or the Gates Foundation, they do incredible work in these other areas, but they have yet, when they look at the upstream drivers of health, they have yet to look at pollution as a key contribution. And so they don't fund those areas yet. But I think what we're moving towards, and I think what Che can still be a driver in, is to bring these different distinctions between the social and environmental together and say, wait a second, it's all part of it, and we have to look at it. And they interact. So I think that's an exciting role for Che to play.
I agree with that. The other thing, I think, to add further to the complexity, a couple of thoughts I want to offer. One is that the toxics activists, the chemical activists, were worried about the ecological paradigm because it brought in all these other factors that you just named. But the other thing that's been going on is that the number of contaminants that we're concerned about has gone beyond chemicals. Mm-hmm. So Che, for example, has an extraordinary science serve on electromagnetic field, and really the field of the science on EMF has developed at Che as a home, mm-hmm. Because many of the leaders in the field of EMF work mm-hmm. Participate in that listserv. It's a very active listserv where the real science goes out every day. Mm-hmm. But we could have equivalent listservs on nanotechnology, on biotechnology, mm-hmm. on robotics. Mm-hmm. There are a whole series of other contaminants mm-hmm. On synthetic chemistry, and so just as the range of major factors in different sectors that you just named, mm-hmm. the environment, the built environment and so forth, have expanded through the ecological paradigm of health. So have the contaminant vectors. Right, the vectors, right. And so the thing that really strikes me is the bad news is that it's complicated, but the good news is that it's complicated. The good news is that in the ecological paradigm of health, if, for example, you are exposed to lots of chemical toxins, there are, in fact, other things you can do to build resilience, even in the face of that. So good diet, stress mm-hmm. reduction, mm-hmm. exercise, social support. And guess what? Not only do those build resilience, but those are also the same resilience factors that are now being widely used to reverse chronic disease by people like Dean Ornish on heart disease and others on diabetes and so on and so forth. It turns out that, as Ted often says, that everything becomes health policy. Education becomes health policy. Agriculture becomes health policy. You know, that all of these things, because we're dealing with a holistic ecological framework, become health policy. So if getting rid of chemicals in a community is incredibly hard to do, it's not necessarily the only thing you can do to improve health in that community. There are a bunch of other things.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, the resiliency, I mean, that's what unfortunately, we all have these chemicals, as you said, in our bodies. We have to figure out other ways to make ourselves as healthy as possible so that we can withstand the kind of onslaught and work towards removing those exposures.
And that's why we have a science cert called Shea Integrative Health, which is the one place that I know in the United States where the people concerned with contaminants meet the integrative medicine people from Andrew Weil's program, the functional medicine people, the osteopaths, the chiropractors, and all the others, where we're really saying, guess what? There's a perfect fit between all these stress factors and the need to reimagine what healthcare looks like, not just in terms of biomedicine, but in terms of all the lifestyle and related issues. And they get it. You know, I was at a conference last weekend in San Diego of naturopaths and osteopaths, which was all about what to do about toxic chemical exposures, you know? So there really is a fit between the health-promoting activities that Commonwealth's involved with in the Cancer Help Program and our Healing Circles work and other things like that, and the work on, you know.
And I think one other piece, and we do include this in our website, we're still developing some of the pages, is about war. And, you know, I'm Bob Gould, who's here, with Physicians for Social Responsibility and the Program for Reproductive Health and the Environment at UCSF. I remember you're emphasizing that to me after one of our children's environmental health conferences, where you haven't brought up, you know, war and all the deprivation that comes from that, and you know, of course, nuclear war is still, you know, possibly out there. All those considerations, that is a huge factor, and certainly right now with all the wars going on around the world and the refugees from those wars and the children that are being impacted on every level. And of course, there's some exposure to toxics, but there's also just the stress level and malnutrition and other factors that are equally as important, and we need to bring those in too.
Even on the war thing, and Bob, I'm going to ask you to comment in a moment, but even on the war thing, when people talk about Iraq and Syria and so on, the level of contamination that war creates with these uranium-tipped weapons or whatever it is, I don't remember all the specifics, but quite aside from everything else, the environmental health impact on reproductive health and children being born with all kinds of problems and cancer rates and so on.
Birth defects.
And that's going to go on for an incredibly long time, you know. But it never gets mentioned in the literature on war, you know, or almost never. Bob, as you've listened to this conversation, you've been involved with Shea from the beginning, and just any thoughts or reflections you have on the story we've been telling?
Well, since, you know, as you all have opened up the issue, you know, the issue of war gets to the very heart of how we organize our society. And since the central sort of economic framework of our world sort of, in my view, sort of can be encapsulated within the petrodollars, pumping of oil, arms sales, keeping these conflicts going, that obviously has the manifold unhealthful effects on a global scale, also keeps us from dealing with climate and the whole petrochemical flow, if you will. So, you know, the Institute for Policy Studies for a number of years has been putting out some reports which are comparing climate security, what we pay to preserve the climate in terms of what we need to do, versus the traditional concepts of military security. And if we take out all the billions, hundreds of billions of dollars for the certain conceptions that are now seeing with our current administration, you know, building walls, continue to have these types of interventions, they impair our ability to deal with climate change. But what we're spending for climate security is something on the order of 1 to 2% of what we spend on military conceptions of security, and fully half of that is to subserve the Pentagon planning to intervene with all of the refugees and others who are going to continue to stress our planet. I'm reminded of something that Ted shared last week, which is dealing with the bimodality that we have to take into, with all of this, what the interplay between what the planetary capacity to deal with this stuff versus the human impacts, and there's no bigger human impact than war. And the fact that our country is going to spend $1 trillion in the next 30 years to modernize our nuclear weapons that could kill us in an instant, that's $4 million an hour. You could see the interactions and where we could use those types of resources to really change things much more fundamentally. Sorry for rambling on. You got me going.
Exactly.
But anyway, I think those connections should be obvious, and they are imperative that we bring the movements together for change, because too much there's been a divide between the quote-unquote environmentalist side of things and those who've been working for peace. They're all integrated, and in the spirit of what we're talking about here, we have to think, particularly at this time, how we're going to bring that together.
That's really helpful. I want to go to Cheryl Patton, who has been part of this work for a long time and heads the Biomonitoring Resource Center at Commonweal, and is my wife and partner, for full disclosure. But Cheryl, as you have participated in, you co-lead the whole endocrine disruption series of teleconferences in the Collaborative on Health and the Environment. But as you've listened to this, what comes to your mind in terms of reflection?
I just want to say that through Elise's leadership, the Collaborative on Health and the Environment is recognized around the world. Just standing on the shoulders of Che, it makes it much easier for me to reach out to scientists and have them be on the call or to engage in other ways. So just what you've done has been so amazing. I'm so enormously grateful to walk into a room and say, I'm from Commonwealth Board Che, oh, some lights go on. So that's always good. And I just want to acknowledge my gratitude to you.
It means a lot.
I think that the calls that we do on endocrine disrupting chemicals continue to be extremely popular. And we're joined by agency representatives in the U.S. government and other researchers and academicians. So it's really interesting to me how much interest continues to be there about these chemicals and how they work, what the pathways of exposures are, what diseases they're connected to, and the insidious effect they have on our lives generation after generation after generation, and how they can be potentiated through the synergistic effects of other factors. We don't ignore that at all. So that continues to be a really important focus for me, and I'm grateful for Che's sponsorship of that and be able to work with Theo Colburn's organization, the Endocrine Disrupting Collaborative and Exchange, and with HEALS, Che's a partner in Europe, to publicize what's going on around this continuing tide of toxic chemicals we're exposed to. And as you mentioned, it's not hundreds of chemicals, it's thousands. The estimate is we're carrying around about 6,000 chemicals in our bodies that are used in industrial processes or are essentially man-made. And we're able to now, at this point, to biomonitor. It's hard to say because of fast throughput, but a couple of years ago, maybe we could test for 600 of those. So just to continue to talk about the tide of toxic chemicals remains important. It's important to eat your carrots, it's important to get exercise, it's important to have community support. But the new thing that happens in this generation and the past is toxic chemical exposures. So to have that nested in Che is really, really important. You've asked the wrong person to talk because I get carried on about this trip. But I just want to say that one last thing about biomonitoring. Governments will tend to use it to indicate trends in chemical use and exposures, but the on-the-ground use of biomonitoring in communities allows that community to organize, to stabilize, to capacity build, to learn the stories, and to mobilize. It's incredibly powerful in ways that other things are not.
Mm-hmm.
And it's political. Chemical exposures is political. Asthma is political.
That's right.
You know, a lot of these diseases are political in their nature.
Right.
So,
Cancer's political, asthma's political, cancer's political, infertility's political, and Allie Carlson, we've talked about you, but I want to come back to you. You've been involved with Che from very early on and have been doing extraordinary work trying to replace toxic chemicals with green chemicals and products. What are your reflections as you listen to this?
I had a really big one, which was the importance of mentors, that Che became a platform, sort of an attractant for people like me, you know, a home. It gave me a place to organize my thoughts and you know, I'll just cite a few of the people. So number one, meeting with Charles for lunch, who gave shape to what it was I cared about and referred me to you. Your mentorship in helping us to think through that first workshop on reproductive health and fertility and chemicals at Vallombrosa, it wouldn't have occurred to me to use the wing spread model. That really changed the trajectory of the work, that one sentence that you spoke. I'm not sure I forgive you for it yet because it was so much work, but it was worth it. Ted Shetler and Pete Myers, who were ever available to me to check my thinking, so I could consult with them on the validity of a study that I was writing about, or just check my thinking, thought partnership. Guidance on the science was absolutely, none of this would have happened without the science advisors of Che. So I know, well, Commonweal and Che. So for me, that was incredibly moving, and I get credit as I did today, but I keep wanting to say no. You know, I was a tool, but it was the community of experts that Commonweal and Che bring that really makes things happen.
And really, what Che's intention was has never been more fully realized than in fertility work. Say a word about the major partners that are carrying that forward now.
Oh, it's so exciting. I'm so happy that I'm not associated, my name is not, you know, it's other people who've adopted this. And so the biggest outcome, I would say, well, first was professional societies. You know, it was amazing for me when we started this work to look around and the Association of Reproductive Health Specialists didn't really pay any attention to the issues of environment and pollution and way upstream prevention. That was true of a lot of the medical societies, and so it was really fun, actually, with the backing of the expertise here to call up the executive director of ASRM and say, hey, how come you guys know nothing and pay no attention to this really important thing? And he just happened, the executive director happened to believe it was something they should pay attention to. And I feel like we turned that society, and they now have a special interest group. They have programming in all their annual meetings. They promote research and have had a research prize in chemicals and infertility. So professional society work is really important on the Hill. Members of Congress listen to, as they say all the time when you go there, doctors, incredibly firefighters have credibility on the Hill, as do you know, the victims of disease. So professional society work that was carried on also by Steve Heilig and the San Francisco Medical Society and his partnership as a director of Che with pediatrics and other groups. So I've really admired how much Che has affected content in professional medical and health disease societies. And the other big partnership was my doctor at Stanford in infertility, Dr. Linda Giudice, Elise mentioned her. Michael called me up. I had called my doctor and said, you know, why is Stanford so bad at environmental health and Berkeley is so good? And I did that on purpose, just to see if my alma mater would pay attention. And she picked up right away on this and joined our early in the CHE working group. And Michael called me up and said, Allie, do you understand what it means to have the director of women's health at Stanford? And also she was head of the REI, Reproductive Endocrinology and Infertility Clinic. You stay close to her, bring her close. We ended up becoming really good friends, and she kind of co-led the Vallombrosa meeting. And then, as she got recruited by UCSF, David Kessler at UCSF, to become the chair of OBGYN at UCSF, I said, great, ask him for a couple $100,000 to start a program called Reproductive Health and the Environment at UCSF. We couldn't get it going at Stanford. And so she did that, and with CHE's partnership, CHE gets less recognition than it deserves for organizing the 2007 CHE UCSF Summit on Reproductive Health and the Environment, which gathered 400 scientists, doctors, and health advocates from around the world. And I'll just end by saying that launched the program at UCSF, which is still growing, expanding, has the support of the dean and the chancellors there. They have great plans, and they picked up a lot of what CHE was doing originally. And I still, to this day, run into people. Arlene Bloom, our favorite scientist on flame retardants, held a workshop recently, and I went there, and I asked a question, and a doctor came running up to me saying, CHE changed my life, because I was struggling about this. I had a health issue myself, and nobody understood environmental factors, and I've since changed to become a functional med doctor, and it was at the summit that happened. Arlene Bloom, likewise, had been out of that science for a long time and was involved in this conversation, said, that happened for me too. You know, it was amazing to be at the summit and to reconnect with, it's what got me back into the field, and she's going great guns. So it's hard to even imagine all the tentacles that come out of the CHE.
And you're very modest about it, but the fact remains that one of the things that 41 years at Commonweal has taught me is that almost all our important work results from, in any given field, one person deciding to take it on, who has the skills to do it. And then others gather around that person. But there has to be one person who takes something on and says, this is my dharma, this is my life work for this period of time. And it is simply worth acknowledging that in the thing that CHE has had the greatest single success in, which is reproductive health and pregnancy compromise, that you were that one person, and that it almost always connects to a personal passion, to a personal experience that we've had that make us say, we want to change this. We want to witness to this. Yeah.
Michael, can I add a comment? Since we're talking about the program on reproductive health and the environment that Allie initiated, that Patrice Sutton is here, who has been working with the program for reproductive health and the environment since it began. And Patrice has been working a lot behind the scenes, but has been a major driver of that program in many, many ways. But the amount of work that she has turned out in published papers as a primary author is astounding, and will live forever in the peer-reviewed literature. So I think we owe Patrice a debt of gratitude.
Well, a debt of gratitude, but also, Patrice, would you speak to this? I apologize for not
Michael, can you make sure, Patrice, you have to talk about ACOG, the fact that you turned that society, which is probably as important as TES.
So Allison and CHE, we talked about the beginning of the program, and so because we were at UCSF, really, we were able to leverage was health professional societies and the American Congress of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, which in terms of what Michael was saying, Jeannie Conry, who in terms of you have a person who moves it and who's a champion. So Allison begot Linda, who begot Jeannie Conry. And so we had a champion there. And by leveraging the really one of the most important U.S. women's health professional societies around these issues, that ultimately the International Federation of Gynecology and Obstetrics, FIGO, Jeannie and Linda having the domestic, really tremendous support. So I was able to move this globally. And it is true that right now doctors around the world believe the science. It's like we have completely, this work has completely changed the conversation from whether or not chemicals and environment affects reproductive health to what to do about it and how to bring this into the policy arena. So it really started with Che and has really, in that sense, got global traction now.
Patrice, what has been the focus of your writing and work within that?
Well, the program that Allison made happen has two parts. One is basic research, and we look at chemicals that are in each trimester of pregnancy and environmental exposures. So we collaborate with stem cell folks at UCSF, looking at placental development and environmental chemicals. We look at the second trimester because we have a relationship with the Women's Option Center at UCSF, and then we look at two cohorts that both at the General and at Mission Bay. So we have all of this basic research program, but I have my own personal contribution has been on the research translation side, which has really been about health professional engagement. And the other piece of it has been that if we want physicians and policymakers to act on the science, we need to have a kind of system that's comparable to evidence-based medicine for our science. And I just want to, I'm seeing Heather here, which I haven't seen her in a long time. It's so nice to see you. Heather was, and Ted, of course, was at the original meeting. I think, Allison, you were there, too, of what was called the Navigation Guide, which is kind of a big part of the work that I've spearheaded, which is how do you translate what we know about environmental chemicals to make a decision about what to do now. It's in a systematic and transparent way. So we developed this systematic review method for application in environmental health.
Thank you. And I'm so glad, I love the way this dances around the room, because I was going to come to Heather Cervantes next. And Heather, who has worked in women's health issues at Commonweal for many, many years, and has been involved with Che and many other dimensions of our work in environmental health. Heather, as you listen to the conversation, what are your thoughts, reflections?
Well, I will echo just the gratitude hearing the stories of what you've kicked off, Elise. It's really wonderful to pull this narrative together and see how we all sort of tip each other's dominoes in certain ways. So I have worked a lot on the advocacy side of things, and so I think about how do we make science useful for social change. And there's no doubt that the cohesion of the science has been critical in things like the Campaign for Safe Cosmetics, which I worked on for many years, and being able to access the information, but also just to figure out who to talk to, what scientists to talk to, and who would be open-minded about helping us review the work to make sure that the advocates actually get it right. So even though Che didn't take on policy platforms necessarily, they still provided a great networking resource to make sure that we were getting the science right when we were releasing reports that actually had ripple effects up on Capitol Hill. So you want to get it right when you're at that level, certainly. So that was profound. But I think in thinking about where I stand in the stream of the work of Che at this moment, I'm excited about a project that I've just started with Breast Cancer Fund, recently renamed Breast Cancer Prevention Partners, developing a cancer prevention platform for the state of California. And in listening to the way you two were talking, there's no way that our work on this doesn't come directly from the work of years gone by. And so most states have a cancer plan of some sort that focuses on screening, and they'll often tell you to stop smoking and get a little exercise. But they really don't take this big, comprehensive approach to how can we work on the resilience, how can you overall, through various aspects of your life, reduce your risk for cancer overall. And so our project, which is a 2-year project funded by the California Breast Cancer Research Program, will be pulling together a network of people to look at the role of physical activity and food and occupational exposures and environmental exposures and social determinants of health, and trying to pull the best thinking together so that we can make a policy proposal for the state of California for cancer prevention. And we'll see how it goes. It's a tight timeline. We've got Ted Shetler on the advisory committee as well as many others. But this will hopefully be a model for the rest of the states and then ultimately federally. And we do have somebody from the CDC who's going to be an advisor on this. So I think we have the potential to have a runway for real impact over time.
So sitting right next to Heather here in the audience is our friend and colleague Neil Gundel, who has been a friend and partner of Che for a very long time and was himself one of the early pioneers of this work in San Francisco. Neil, as you've listened to this conversation, do you have any reflection?
Well, for people to get a sense of where I'm coming from, I had a much different life, doing a lot of other things, and around 1990, I decided to create the Healthy Children Organizing Project in San Francisco, which at that time was called the Childhood Lead Poisoning Prevention. And that was the start of a lot of things that happened throughout the country for the first time, because lead was one of the first chemicals, if you want to call it that, that was really actually researched. And San Francisco was literally painted with lead. I came at it from an outlier approach, because here I was in San Francisco and Che wasn't created, and I said, what do I do? So I decided to organize the whole city. So that meant government and all the communities in San Francisco that are disappearing, where they're very poor people in very poor housing, and their houses are loaded with lead. So I spent 10, 15 years doing that with the landlords and the tenants and everybody else. And the people provided family and children's services who speak the right language to try and bring it into the communities, so the neighborhoods themselves, who speak lots of other languages and don't get outside their neighborhoods, tell each other what to do to protect themselves. But this was just kind of the beginning, and as Che got created and I saw this going on, and I said, who are these people? Because I didn't know. And I got to know. And what happened in this period, 2000 on, slowly but surely and more, was learning about chemicals and what people have in their houses, especially in the poorer communities where they don't have a choice. And you can imagine the things they have in their houses. And we switched to the Healthy Children Organizing Project about that time. And what Che helped us with was what this all meant in terms of how it affected people, because we couldn't do the research, but we had people out in the community all over. And if I hadn't retired because I was getting old, what I was getting from the California Endowment and some other people was I was basically telling them I wanted to change the marketplace. I want the people in the community to stop buying that stuff, and I want them to get healthy things to clean with and eat and so on and so forth. And then you can see all these things coming together. And I hope somebody continues to do it, but that's what I left with, was we need to change the marketplace. All of us. I go in and Safeway and the hair in the back of my head just goes, I got to get out of here.
Right. Thank you, Neil.
Yeah.
I want to come back to Elise now. We've been hearing from some of the people who have been very central to our partnership work. What are your reflections as you listen?
Well, I think one piece we haven't mentioned yet, and Ted has also been very instrumental, is our latest kind of product, if you will, which is a story of health. Mm-hmm. And Ted and Maria Valenti, who is coordinating our, healthy aging, but she's now primarily working on this project. And we have colleagues at the ATSDR, the Agency for Toxic Substances and Control Registry. Did I get that? Thank you. And what they base this on, and it really is a reflection of the ecological model of health, is a family reunion. And it's an ebook. And so in the family reunion, there's, so-and-so Stephen with asthma, and Amelia with a learning disability, and, another person with childhood leukemia. And then there's going to be other chapters on reproductive health, which is the next one that will be coming out. And the ebook provides this research-rich, centralized information on all the science. It has interactive videos. It has, the graphics. It has it in simple, accessible language. But if you want to go deeper, there's, thousands and thousands of references. And very excitingly, it's on the Centers for Disease Control website. They're hosting the continuing education credits, and this book, A Story of Health, this ebook, is their most popular course, 3 times as popular as their next one in terms of people registering for the CE credits. And I think that says a lot about the work. There's 3 more chapters that are right now, hope to come out. It's incredible work. It's been done on a shoestring. And I think that is, that product, if you will, is now unfolding in other ways that we really hoped it would on the community level. And Charles, whom I believe had to
step out.
And Maria Valenti and others have created a puppet show that works with some of the Hispanic community around these issues, and they're also creating a graphic novel. And so there are more and more ways that we can get outside the lab coats in the temple, right? Whatever, and really get this information to communities in ways that are accessible. And so that project, to me, is just the most recent of Che's efforts, has been really effective, and I think will continue to be so. I also want to mention when Charles was talking about biomonitoring and how important that has been to us, one of the reports that Che helped to work on along with a number of other colleagues, and Charles was instrumental, was Mind Disrupted. And so using the biomonitoring techniques, and just with a few people, because they're pretty expensive, deciding on 15 people in the learning and developmental disabilities community, as well as people with learning and developmental disabilities, to have themselves biomonitor, their blood taken, and so forth, and analyze for a certain number of chemicals in their bodies, and then become spokespeople about why having these chemicals in their bodies is a corporate trespass, because we didn't say, okay, we're okay with all these industrial chemicals that haven't been tested in our bodies. Mm-hmm. And so it's been that particular product, and Charles and others have worked on many, many others. We actually took, and we had a congressional testimony, and we had media and so forth when we released it. And we weren't, of course, saying that we couldn't say there was a causal relationship between these exposures and anything that anyone was experiencing, because we can't. We just described all these other factors. But what we could say is that we've been exposed to chemicals that do have the potential to impact neurodevelopment. And we didn't say that it was okay. They're in our bodies, and so basically we need to change this, and we need to prevent those exposures. And so I think that piece was another very effective tool, and one of the over 60 publications that Che has put out over the years.
Michael?
Yes.
I have to, you've mentioned a couple of federal agencies. Can you and Elise speak a little bit to, you asked about what's grown out of some of the Che efforts. A really important one is the relationship with federal agencies like NICHD, NIEHS, CDC. They've all been, employees, staff have all been members of the working groups. Jerry Heindel, so would you guys talk about that?
Would you say something?
Sure, I'm happy to. I'm also cognizant of time. So these agencies had, I guess we've had the good fortune of having people within those agencies become champions of this information, and created incredible partnerships. You mentioned Jerry Heindel, who just retired from the National Institute for Environmental Health Sciences, and he has been an ally throughout this in terms of not only providing the money for forums where we could have these kinds of conversations to hone our thinking and strategies, but also for various grants in our research and development. And so someone like him, and now Linda Birnbaum, who is director of NIEHS, who's been passionate about these issues and has been an incredible spokesperson and really has helped move the science. And so Che's relationship with these people over the years and has grown, and we have, I think, both provided them with information that they've needed. For example, one of our our tools that people come to Che for is our toxicant and disease database, which was originally developed looking at 200 different disease endpoints and the scientific weight of evidence of what the correlation was between a chemical exposure and that particular health outcome. And actually, NIEHS, this national agency, wrote to us and said, would it be okay if we link to your website, because no one else is doing this, because it's searchable by health endpoint as well as by chemical. And so that's, those are kinds of places that Che played an incredible role in ways that we didn't necessarily anticipate. I think, the CDC, the work around with Dick Jackson was there, and then Howie Frumpkin. Again, these are the people who we were able, I think, because of the legitimacy we created and the reputation we created, to be able to say, we want to talk to you. We think these scientists ought to be on that stage when you do X, Y, Z. And I think that was really an important piece of our work behind the scenes.
Yeah, just two anecdotes. One that's timely is that at a Commonweal board meeting this week, yesterday actually, we approved a new Commonweal program directed by Jerry Heindel called the Program on Endocrine Disruption Strategies as a Commonweal program. Again, as these things happen, this came about because Allie Carlson sent me a note saying, Michael, Jerry's just retired. Wouldn't it be great if he linked up with Commonweal as a place to do his work on endocrine disruption strategies moving forward? So I emailed Jerry and said, Allie suggested this, and
the check's in the mail, by the way. It should be here.
Thank you. And yes, then the Forsythia Foundation is giving us some early support for Jerry's work, and so this is how these things continue to develop. On Dick Jackson, who headed the Environmental Health Lab at the Centers for Disease Control, I vividly remember a lunch with Dick and Phil Lee when we were talking about Che, and what Dick was worried about most at that point was that antibiotics were being extinguished in terms of their efficacy for humans by their use in animal stuff. And so that led us to create the Keep Antibiotics Working Network, which started here at Commonweal. No, I'm sorry. It started with our input, but didn't start here. And then the funder group that supported that as well, the Funders Forum on Antibiotic Resistance. So the issue of antibiotic resistance continues to be one of the most important issues in human health. And there's just a very, very strong possibility that not only all the cancer patients that we're concerned about, but everybody else, that more and more of these antibiotics are not effective anymore. I also just want to acknowledge, because we haven't spoken about it, but it's the elephant in the room, that the new administration is working against every single value that the Collaborative on Health and the Environment, and indeed Commonweal, has worked on for the last 15 years in the Collaborative on Health and the Environment, and 41 years. And I don't want that disruptor to hijack this conversation, but I do want to acknowledge.
Absolutely.
And Ted and I often take walks together, Ted Shetler in the morning, and on our last walk, Ted said to me that we were talking about this period of time, and he said that one of the functions he felt that we are serving at this point is witness. And I think that's true. I think that in times where one cannot control the direction that events are taking, that the power of witness is very great. And at a time when science is under assault by an administration that is trying to defund science, and in a few weeks there's going to be a scientist march in Washington, which Commonweal has endorsed. We didn't endorse it through the Collaborative on Health and the Environment because we don't do advocacy through the Collaborative on Health and the Environment, but Commonweal does advocacy. And so we've endorsed the Science March. And I think, and many of us in different ways, are seeking in whatever ways we can to move America and the world back toward the values that we hold. But I think that the function of witness is a very profoundly important one, that says that science is real, that what we are describing is real, and that no matter what the political currents of the day are, we won't be silent.
Right.
We won't be silent.
Right.
And
it's not a silent witness.
And there are others who are the loud voices and the strident voices, and they play a critical role. But at Commonweal and in the Collaborative on Health and the Environment, I think we serve best. The analogy to the Quakers has been growing on me for some time. Some of you know this, but the Quakers only have 350,000 adult Quakers in the world, 200,000 of whom happen to be in Africa, by the way, which is something most people don't know.
I did not know that.
Yeah. And the Quakers have been at the forefront of every major movement for human dignity and health and peace and so forth since slavery onward. And what is their way of doing this? It is witness.
Yeah.
It is witness. It is gathering in circles and saying there is that of God in every human being, that every person is his or her own minister. You speak your own truth into the silence in the center of the circle. This quiet, small group has been among the most powerful forces for good for the last several hundred years. And so when we talk about the work of Che and the work of Commonweal, and I think about the future of Che and the future of Commonweal, I think this function of witness, of education, of being a quiet voice for truth, it's kind of like being the quiet voice of conscience, you know? It's kind of like saying no matter how strident the world becomes, there's value in kindness and civility. Our motto is science and civility.
That's right.
On the vaccine issue, you know, which it's currently impossible to mention in the public media that vaccines might possibly have an impact on the development of a vulnerable subpopulation of children. Nonetheless, there is a civil dialogue going on within the integrative health and autism listservs, science serves, about vaccines. And people are able to speak civilly to each other about the most explosive issue in public health today. So this function of science and civility and being the quiet voice of conscience and of upholding science when science is under assault, I feel good about that.
I think that's right. I mean, the circles we've created, they are circles of trust and circles of where these kinds of conversations can happen. And of course, we have a few people who it gets a little challenging, but for the most part, it's been extraordinary over all these years where there's been very, difficult conversations around topics like the vaccines, like EMFs, electromagnetic fields, where we're not so sure. People all stay in the same room, kind of, but people continue to come back and continue to work through those conversations, and I think we're kind of the only organization in the environmental health field, or one of the only, which serves as a forum, as an educational forum, as a learning community, not as an advocacy organization. We want to feed those who do that incredible work where the rubber hits the road and continue to work closely with them behind the scenes. But really, this is the one place people can come and learn about the science, have conversations about the science and its implications for human health and for policy and for markets. And I think by retaining that, we have developed a reputation for that kind of quality of witness. And I think as we've moved into this new administration where the assault is, daily and severe, we have to create other ways where these conversations can happen, and I think providing that civility, providing these containers is critical. And I want to give one example of in January, it was told that, the administration decided that the climate change conference that was going to happen over 3 days in February was going to be canceled. And so it occurred to me that, well, we do conference calls all the time. That's what we do. We host these webinars and conversations on difficult topics. And maybe Che can provide, if the Trump administration will shut that one down, maybe Che can be a forum where these kind of conversations can happen. And so I contacted a colleague at the CDC and said, we would be open to hosting this, maybe a day long, but have the same speakers, have the same people here. And within 24, 36 hours, of course, far more powerful people like Al Gore and a few others stepped in and said, oh, we'll get this together. And it was wonderful. But what was also disconcerting for me is my email conversation, and subsequently we never got to talk by phone with this colleague at the CDC. It was very strange for me he's kind of disappeared. I mean, I haven't had any other conversations with him since this, even though he immediately responded and said, yes, let's try to make this happen. Let's talk tomorrow. And then there's been silence. And so it's a new era, and I have not experienced like that kind of concern where my colleagues at EPA, my colleagues at the CDC, I don't know what's going on with them. What I hear is it's very, very difficult. The Mustafa Ali, who's head of the environmental justice, director of the environmental justice at the EPA, had been there for 24 years, resigned yesterday. And they're not going to replace him. And so these are things we're up against, and I think we do need to name them and be witness to them, but also provide the strength of the science and the character to keep standing up and saying this isn't okay. This isn't okay. And I think Che does a very good job of that.
I'd like to take a few minutes that we have remaining to talk to you about where you are going in your life.
It's going to be a very short conversation because I don't know.
Well, but to reprise some of the things that I had hoped we could talk about. You grew up in a political family in Virginia, right? Your father was Attorney General?
That's right.
Right.
And ran for U.S. Senate and governor. And,
right. And so you lived with the strains of being a public family called up on the dais at various events.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, right.
Right. I actually came across a picture recently, and I was probably 6 years old. It was for a campaign brochure. I was at the piano with my pigtails and my nice dress, and my mom was leaning over, and my sister it's all pose, of course. My sister had a book, and she was standing in the library reading it, in front of the baby grand piano, and my brother, who was tossing, he was not particularly athletic, but he was tossing a football, and so the snapshot of the Beaver Cleaver family, this perfectly happy, everything was just great. And it was just like, I looked at that, I just burst out. I mean, it was so poignant and sad on some level, because what it did was create this disconnect from our authenticity, our sense of ourselves, and what we had to present publicly. And I learned that at a very young age, that it wasn't okay to talk about anything that was going on below the chin publicly. And that was a big piece of my life that I still heal from in many ways, is to bring those, integrate those pieces and to live more fully from that center. And Commonweal and Che has certainly allowed me to do that and help heal that. And your brother had a mental illness and ultimately committed suicide. That's right. And so in the midst of this political happy family, my brother was ultimately diagnosed with bipolar and schizoaffective disorder, but he was deeply struggling, and there was terrible abusive scenes in the house while my dad would go out and speak to the public, and he ran twice for Attorney General and then 2 other campaigns for U.S. Senate and governor, and all of this was happening while we were smiling, and it was very painful. It was very painful. Yeah. You went to Dartmouth, and after Dartmouth, you did some very interesting things. You went to India and then spent 2 years at the Insight Meditation Society. Right. Well, so I went to India without any spiritual intention. I got this scholarship to study freedom of the press in India right out of college. And so I had the good fortune of connecting with the Economist and the Christian Science Monitor, and so I was stringing for them. But mostly I was just wandering, and I went to Bodh Gaya because this guy, the Dalai Lama, happened to be doing the Kali Chakra there, which I didn't know anything about. This is 1985, and I, so I got to meet the Dalai Lama and these people because it was a big crowd, and I was a journalist, so I figured I needed to be there. But what I also did there was a teacher of Vipassana meditation. I was doing a 10-day silent retreat, and I decided, well, I'm in India. People talk about meditation. I might as well do it out of intellectual curiosity, right? And so I sat on my first 10-day retreat, and about 4 days into it, I practically grabbed the instructor and said, how can I be a journalist and meditate? These inner and outer worlds had been so completely disconnected in my life. And yet I think I was drawn to going to a place like India, which was the kind of opposite of my East Coast upbringing. And that opened this whole world to me. And that's when I returned. Instead of going on to graduate school in international relations, I went to work as a cook and a housekeeper at the Insight Meditation Society, and then the next year did a series of silent retreats for a year before going back to graduate school. And you went to the Harvard, the Graduate School of Education at Harvard, and studied with Carol Gilligan. That's right. That's right. Who was a great figure in developmental psychology. That's right. And she was one of the first to point out that girls true voice of their authenticity often goes underground at 10, 11, 12. And it was very powerful. It was the first class I took at the ed school, and I brought out all my journal notes from when I was that age. And for the first time, I discovered that the intellect and the heart connect in a very profound way. And so I was able to write my first paper on my own developmental process in the context of this course. And that opened up many more opportunities, and I decided to go to India to see if Carol Gilligan's theory on girls' development was applicable in a developing country like India. And I won't go into the details of that, but I certainly learned that no, a lot of it wasn't applicable because the experience of self in a very different culture made the sense of responsibility, changed the sense of understanding about choice and responsibility, and therefore affected how these girls were in their lives.
And after you did that, you went back to India in 91, 92 with a different...
Well, that was that research.
Well, that's when you went back.
Right, that's when I went back with that research, and then decided not to go on for the doctorate, and that's when I decided I really need to move to California and showed up here.
And the person who sent you out here was John Kabat-Zinn,
that's right,
mutual friend, and that makes the full circle to where we began the conversation.
That's exactly right.
So, any last reflections as you prepare to leave the collaborative unhealthy environment and potentially go back into exploring work with women and young women and girls?
Right. Well, it's interesting when one comes to a place in one's life where there's a sense of completion. Like, I feel like I've given what I can, given my expertise, my background, and so forth, can offer in this field, and there's so much work still to be done. But it's became very clear to me that it's time to move or swerve into a different sector, which actually does tie back to my earlier work where I had been drawn at a much younger age. And that, wanting to bring in those other qualities that I haven't necessarily been able to express at all the scientific conferences that I go to, where spirituality or, one's psychological, emotional, social intelligences are not really valued in the same way, and to bring those front and center and see where else I might be of service in the universe. And I felt extremely well utilized by the universe here, and so profoundly grateful that I could find a place, and I will, this is not a goodbye in any way, shape, or form, but over the last 24 years to find a home where I could more fully become who I am. And you have been that mentor for me all these years, and I am profoundly grateful.
Thank you. Well, I just want to thank Elise's family and close community for coming today, and I'm very moved. I have the good fortune that because Charlotte and I spend 2.5 months of the year on Whidbey, I always take a walk with Elise while I'm up there, and often we come to other events together. But you speak of me as a mentor, Elise, and my experience is that my mentors are, with few exceptions, younger than I am. And so you've been a mentor to me, and you makes me, brings tears to my eyes, because my way of being in the world is that I often start things, but then I find people who are better than I am at doing them. And there's no question that you took Che so far beyond what I would have been able to do or could even imagine. And so, I just want to thank you for 24 years of work together. This is not goodbye. We should mention that this extraordinary young woman, Karen Wang, is our new director, and we're all looking forward to her vision and where she will take Che.
Absolutely.
And she was very sad she couldn't be here today. But it's been a beautiful quarter century together, and I don't think our work is done, and I don't think our work together is done. So
we'll keep you posted.
We'll keep you posted. So thank you all for coming, and let's all go down for lunch.